In a faraway kingdom, surrounded by an endless sea of golden fields, there stood a towering castle where a lonely king ruled. His heart was heavy, for though his land flourished with wheat and wildflowers, he had no heir to share in its beauty. Each day he wandered the castle's many empty rooms, gazing out over his vast kingdom and feeling the silence echo through the grand halls. One day, while strolling through the royal gardens, he came upon a single rosebush that had never bloomed. It sat in a shadowed corner, its thorny branches twisted and bare. The king tended to it himself, hoping to see even a single flower. Day after day, he watered the rosebush and shielded it from the wind, but still it remained barren until one crisp autumn morning when a strange glimmer caught his eye. In the place where the rosebush stood, a young girl now lay curled beneath its branches. Her hair was a deep auburn, like the color of the autumn leaves, and her skin was pale, dusted with a hint of gold. The king took her into his arms and carried her to the castle, unsure if she was human or magic. Yet as soon as she woke, her laughter filled the empty halls and the castle felt alive again. The king, who had known only loneliness for so long, raised her as his daughter. As she grew, the girl brought light and joy to the kingdom. Wherever she went, flowers seemed to spring up at her feet, and the birds followed her song. The people adored her, calling her Rose, for they believed she was a gift from the mysterious rosebush in the garden. But as time went on, the king noticed something strange. Every year, on the eve of her birthday, Rose would grow weaker, her color fading like a flower in the first frost. On these nights, she would wander into the garden and rest beneath the rosebush, as if drawing strength from its withered branches. Years passed, and the day before Rose's 18th birthday, the sky darkened with heavy clouds, and a chill crept into the air. The king watched as Rose, now pale and frail, ventured once more into the garden. He followed her in silence, his heart heavy with dread. As she reached the rosebush, she collapsed, her body trembling like a petal caught in the wind. The king knelt beside her, and his gaze fell upon the rosebush. Where it had always been barren, a single bud now appeared, tightly closed. The king realized then that Rose's life was bound to the plant. For every year she lived, the rosebush drew from her strength, and now, on the eve of her 18th year, it demanded one final gift, her very life. Desperate, the king returned to his castle's ancient library, where dust-covered tomes lay forgotten. He searched through countless books of magic and lore until he found an old, faded manuscript that spoke of a cure. It told of a legendary bird with feathers as red as fire, whose song could grant life to the dying. This bird, the phoenix of the Far East, nested in the tallest peaks, where mortals seldom dared to tread. The king left at once, journeying far beyond his kingdom through wild forests and over treacherous mountains. He traveled until his strength nearly gave out, driven only by his love for Rose. At last he reached the fabled mountains where the phoenix was said to dwell. The air grew thin and cold as he climbed, but he pressed on until he stood upon the summit, where a lone tree of flame-colored leaves grew. Atop the tree perched the phoenix, its feathers shimmering like embers. The king fell to his knees, silently pleading with this creature. The phoenix gazed down at him with eyes like glowing coals, then spread its magnificent wings and took flight. It circled above the king, leaving a trail of fiery sparks in the air before finally letting a single scarlet feather drift down to him. The moment it touched the king's hands, a warmth surged through him as if the sun itself had filled his heart. He bowed his head in gratitude, and with the feather clutched tightly, he began the long journey home. The king returned to his kingdom just as the sun was rising on Rose's 18th birthday. He hurried to the garden where she lay motionless beneath the rosebush. Her skin was pale as winter's first frost, and her breath was faint. With trembling hands, he placed the phoenix feather upon her chest. As it settled, the feather glowed brightly, then burst into a brilliant flame that did not burn, but bathed Rose in a golden light. The rosebush trembled, and the single bud slowly unfurled, blossoming into the most beautiful rose the kingdom had ever seen, its petals crimson and glistening like rubies. As the flower bloomed, color returned to Rose's cheeks, and her eyes fluttered open. She rose to her feet, stronger than she had ever been, and as she did, the petals of the rose drifted away, carried by a gentle breeze. The curse was broken. The rosebush, having drawn all it could from Rose, now shared its magic with her, giving her life and beauty that would never fade. The people marveled at the sight, calling it a miracle, and the garden where the rosebush had stood became a sacred place, where flowers bloomed all year round and the air always seemed to carry the sweet scent of roses. And so Rose lived on, bringing light and joy to the kingdom as its beloved princess. The king, no longer lonely, knew that his daughter's life was no longer tied to the rosebush, but to the love that had saved her. The story of the king's journey and the blossoming rose was told for generations, reminding all who heard it that sometimes even the most fragile things can be saved through acts of pure and selfless love. And they lived happily ever after.